Welcome to The Mystic and the Skeptic, the show that asks the tough questions and explores different alternatives to today's pressing issues, theories, or enigmas.
A podcast devoted to the exploration of all things mystical, philosophical, scientific, political, conspiratorial, and cosmic. Join us in an exploration of the mystic-skeptic mindspace.
In this week's show, we continue our discussion of early Christianity, Greco-Roman culture, and Gnosticism with Robert Conner. He's the author of The Secret Gospel of Mark, and he's also the author of Jesus the Sorcerer and the website Magic and Christianity. His articles, The Romans Meet Jesus and Faking Jesus, are featured on thisinfo.com. Discuss with him the controversy around the enigmatic document called The Secret Gospel of Mark. We also discuss the Gospel birth narratives, which have many parallels in different cultures. In our previous show, when we had Robert Conner as our guest, we discussed the topic magic and the supernatural in the early church, focusing on Jesus' relation to Greek culture and how the Apostle Paul borrowed ideas for some of the mystery cults in the Mediterranean. We also discussed sorcery and demonology in the Greco-Roman culture of that time. This episode is very controversial in nature, especially as our guest shares information that can be misconstrued by some. We hope to be sensitive to people of the Christian faith, and this show is not an attack against their beliefs. Instead, it's part of our research on topics related to objective truth, and having someone who has studied the history, the text, and the different scholarly views regarding this ancient religion, we hope to come to a better understanding of what was going on at that time. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss topics in an open forum. We hope that this can serve as an example of free speech and the ability to gain understanding from different perspectives. Tell us a little bit about your book, The Secret Gospel of Mark. Does it just discuss the politics behind the document, or does it go into any new revelations that the world needs to know about?
Now, there are no new revelations, believe me, about the Secret Gospel of Mark. For those who are not familiar with it, the Secret Gospel of Mark is basically a handwritten text copied into a book found in a monastery by a scholar named Morton Smith. Smith was a history professor at Columbia University at the time. He had a PhD, actually one from the university, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and another from Harvard. And he was in a monastery in, actually about 12 miles south and east of Jerusalem, a monastery in the Kidron Valley, and he was in their library, if that's what you want to call it, looking for manuscript material. And he was examining this book that was already about 300 or so years old, and he found a handwritten piece of material copied into the end pages, and he photographed that and had a number of experts look at it, and they decided that it was a Greek script, probably written about 200 years before Smith had found it. So Smith eventually kind of deciphered this. This writing is very, very hard to read. It's if you think you have bad handwriting, you should see this. But at any rate, it potentially was a letter of a church official called Clement of Alexandria, and it was quoting a couple of passages from a version of the Gospel of Mark that was previously unknown. Smith's interpretation of it was he gave it a kind of homoerotic spin, which did not go over very well in the mainstream academic community at the time, particularly back in the 1970s. This did not fly. No one was interested in it, although the actual document itself does not specifically say that. That was Smith's interpretation of it. And having translated the document and written a book about it and followed the controversy over a period of probably 15 years or more, I I would say that as apocryphal documents go, the secret gospel of Mark is really not particularly scandalous or even very different from the general run of apocryphal material. But nevertheless, Smith stirred up quite a bit of controversy about it because of his interpretation, and people within the Catholic and mostly evangelical branch of scholarship began to cast doubt on it and claim that it was a forgery, that Smith had forged it, that Smith was just trying to pump up his reputation and so on. So this book that I did was, at the suggestion of my editor, was basically based on a long essay. And rather than revise the essay and update it, he said, just do it as a book. So it basically translates the letter. It talks about the circumstances of Smith's discovery. It talks about the scholarly reaction to it. It tries to situate the material very briefly into a larger culture of what was going on at the time that Clement supposedly wrote it. So long story short, yeah, and a lot of it is about the politics behind it, the particularly apologetic response that scholars, some scholars and some people who are not that scholarly, simply just do not want this material to be real. They don't want it to represent a lost edition of Mark. Personally, I think the odds of it being authentic are probably greater than 90%. I've argued for that. And a number of other writers who are much, much more involved and much closer to the subject than I am have published some pretty devastating critiques of Morton Smith's detractors, which the reader is referred to. But it's a technical and rather convoluted kind of controversy to follow. You have to, it's almost kind of hard to keep up with it. There's so many red herrings have been thrown out there, in my opinion, and have been refuted that at some point the average person would probably say, hey, you know what, it doesn't make any difference anyway, because it adds very little to nothing of our understanding of the New Testament. It probably adds extremely little to the picture of Jesus, even if you accept the fragments as being genuine, which I do. It's kind of a teapot tempest, big squabble about not very much. Or as the ancient Greeks would call it, a fight about the shadow of a donkey. So, but yeah, if you're into that, if you're into looking at the way that scholarly debate works and doesn't work, and how it fails, then I think the book is interesting.
I'm looking at The Shadow of the Donkey right now, one of the translations of it, and I want to know where is the erotic stuff? There's a lot of stuff about Satan, about hidden things, and then who's supposed to write this? Was it a church father, or was it one of Jesus' disciples?
Yeah, no, Clement of Alexandria is not recognized as a, quote, church father. I think actually he got thrown out of the sacred calendar at some point. He's an interesting guy, but I think he was a little bit too unorthodox to stay on the church calendar officially, so he's not really, as far as I recall, officially recognized as a father of the church. Clement was an interesting guy. He was apparently very well read in Greek philosophy, and he was one of the first people who tried to take Christianity and explain it in terms of Greek philosophy. So he was probably a little overeducated for his day, and probably flying pretty high above the heads of most of the people that he talked to. So basically what he was doing was responding to another church official about this Gospel of Mark that they had encountered that had some things in it that were disturbing. And so in the process of refuting that gospel, Clement quotes a couple of passages from it, and that's the point of interest. Clement says that Jesus went to this young man and taught him the mystery of the kingdom of God. And the way it's said in there, it appears that in the original gospel that was being quoted, it talked about a naked man with a naked man. And Morton Smith kind of took an imaginative leap and decided that must have been some kind of homoerotic baptismal ritual or something. It bears mention that the secret gospel of Mark doesn't say anything about baptism, and that the passage of Mark that these fragments would fit back into, even though they make perfect sense when fitted back into to our present day Gospel of Mark. Baptism is not under discussion. So in my opinion, I've never believed that baptism was under discussion, even the first time that I read Smith's book back, almost 20 years ago. I thought, that doesn't sound right. And I've never seen anything to convince me since that the subject of baptism or initiation was being discussed. So I think that they find that the letter is genuine and that the fragments of Mark that it quotes are very likely genuine. They fit back into the regular gospel seamlessly. That's a perfect fit. The language matches, everything matches, the flow of the narrative matches, it kind of completes a narrative arc. But I don't believe that Morton Smith's interpretation of it was correct, and I think that the detractors who questioned the baptismal part of it in the past and people who question it today are almost certainly correct that he got that part of it wrong. That being said, Smith was a controversial individual. He was a very bright guy, but he didn't suffer fools gladly, and he made some enemies. And he was clearly not a believer in Christianity. He was a student of it, and he was a professor who built a career on writing about early Christianity. In fact, in Betts's book, The Greek Magical Papyri and Translation, a number of those translations were done by Morton Smith, just as an aside. So he was a big authority on ancient magic and ancient religion and ancient history and what have you, but I think that he got that part of it wrong. I think he overreached. I think he saw what he wanted to see, and that was basically, the end of it.
For our audience, I'll read the whole thing so you get an idea what it is. But it does mention several women. It mentions, the sister of Lazarus. I'm reading the Secret Gospel of Mark, available on gnosis.org, part of the Gnostic Society Library. This version is called the Annotated Manuscript Version, and is we're reading Folio 1 and Folio 2. A letter attributed to Clement of Alexandria. From the letters of the most holy Clement, the author of the Stramotes, to Theodore. You did well in silencing the unspeakable teachings of the Carpocratians, for these are the wandering stars, referred to in the prophecy, who wander from the narrow road of the commandments into boundless abyss of the carnal and bodily sins. For, providing themselves in knowledge, as they say, of the deep things of Satan, they do not know that they are casting themselves away into the nether world of darkness, of falsity and boasting, that they are free, they have become slaves of servile desires. Such men are to be opposed in all ways and altogether. For even if they should say something true, one who loves the truth should not even so agree with them, for not all true things are the truth. Nor should I, that the truth which merely seems true, according to human opinions, be preferred to be true truth, that according to the faith. Now, the things they keep saying about the divinely inspired gospel according to Mark, some have altogether falsifications, and others, even if they do contain some true elements, nevertheless are not reported truly. For the true things being mixed with inventions are falsified, so that, as the saying goes, even the salt loses its savor. As for Mark, then, during Peter's stay in Rome, he wrote an account of the Lord's doings, not, however, declaring all of them, nor yet hinting at the secret ones, but selecting what he thought most useful for the increasing the faith of those who were being instructed. But when Peter died a martyr, Mark came over to Alexandria, bringing both his own notes and those of Peter, from which he transferred to his former book the things suitable to whatever makes for progress towards knowledge. Thus he composed a more spiritual gospel for the use of those who were being perfected. Nevertheless, he yet did not divulge the things not to be uttered, nor did he write down the hierophantic teaching of the Lord. But to the stories already written he added yet others, and moreover brought in certain sayings in which he knew the interpretation would, as a mystagogue, lead the hearers into innermost sanctuary of that truth hidden by the 7 seals. Thus, in some, he prepared matters neither grudgingly nor incautiously, in my opinion, and, dying, he left his composition to the church in Alexandria, where it even yet is most carefully guarded, being read only to those who are being initiated into the great mysteries. But since the foul demons are always devising destruction for the race of men, Carpocrates, instructed by them and using deceitful arts, so enslaved a certain presbyter of the church in blasphemous and carnal doctrine, and moreover polluted, mixing the spotless and holy words, utterly shameless lies. From this mixture is drawn off the teaching of Carpocratians. To them, therefore, as I said above, one must never give way, nor, when they put toward their falsifications, should one concede that the secret gospel is by Mark, but should even deny it on an oath. For not all true things are to be said to all men. For this reason the wisdom of God, through Solomon, advises, answer the fool from his folly, teaching that the light of the truth should be hidden from those who are mentally blind. Again it says, for him who has not shall be taken away, and let the fool walk in darkness. But we are children of light, have been illuminated by dayspring of the Spirit of the Lord from on high, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, it says, there is liberty, for all things are pure to the pure. To you, therefore, I shall not hesitate to answer the questions you have asked, refuting the falsifications by the very words of the gospel. For example, after they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and what follows until after the 3 days shall rise, the secret gospel brings the following material word for word. And they come into Bethany, and a certain woman whose brother had died was there, and coming she prostrated herself before Jesus, and says to him, Son of David, have mercy on me. But the disciples rebuked her, and Jesus, being angered, went off with her into the garden where the tomb was, and straightway a great cry was heard from the tomb. And going near Jesus, rolled away the stone from the door of the tomb. And straightway, going in where the youth was, he stretched forth his hand and raised him, seizing his hand. But the youth, looking upon him, loved him, and began to beseech him that he might be with him. And going out of the tomb, they came into the house of the youth, for he was rich. And after 6 days, Jesus told him what to do, and in the evening the youth comes to him, wearing a linen cloth over his naked body. And he remained with him that night. For Jesus taught him the mystery of the kingdom of God. And thence, arising, he returned to the other side of the Jordan. After these words follows the text, and James and John came to him. and all that section, but naked men with naked men, and the other things about which you wrote are not found. And after the words, and he comes into Jericho, the secret gospel adds only, and the sister of the youth whom Jesus loved, and his mother and Salome were there, and Jesus did not receive them. But the many other things about which you wrote both seem to be and are falsifications. Now the true explanation, and that which accords with the true philosophy. This is where the fragment ends. Churches, books, all kinds of media attention has been created around all kinds of strange things that people can find on these texts, but how do you make heads or tails with all this information, and what helps people stay grounded so they can study it consistently without going off on rabbit trails?
I'm a minimalist. I am a real minimalist. I think that you have to be extremely careful about reading things in. There's actually a technical term for it. Eisegesis is the term of reading things in. Exegesis is reading out what's actually there. That's why I'm kind of a stickler for text. I believe that you can take almost anything in. Well, there's an old expression: the Bible is a fiddle, and you can play any tune on it. And that there's unfortunately that's got a lot of truth to it. I think that you can see a lot of things anywhere in the Bible. Spacemen, all kinds of just crazy stuff, and it goes way, way back. I mean, the Gnostics did that. They would find a word or something, and they would extract the most bizarre meanings from it. They would use numerology. They would use all kinds of just the most bizarre interpretive strategies to find meaning. And we have the same thing going on here. You've got the book, the Bible Code or something, and it's like, I look at the title and I cringe. I just and I laugh at the same time. It's like, no, sorry, no code. Not there, really. Or you look at, the idea that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had children and they became royalty in Europe, and I'm going like, wow, how likely is that? It's just, it's a really strange thing, and it's good that you bring it up and that you're conscious of it, because people come up with very, very weird stuff, and then it gets questioned and it gets knocked down. But unfortunately, once it's in print, it's always there, and it keeps coming back. It's like the apocalypticism that you see in like the late great Planet Earth, with a picture of the planet burning on the front cover. And I look at it and I think I'm pretty sure, like about 100% sure, that that's probably not what Jesus was talking about. I think that one of the other things that you can do is to go back and take a reference like Josephus or something, who is a pretty close, contemporary of Jesus, and use that as kind of background to get a sense of the history of what was going on, and think about, okay, the Romans took over Palestine under Pompey, and basically the Herodians, the Herod family, the Herodians is a little different, but the family of the Herods are basically a client state of Rome. Rome says, if you just keep it quiet here, so we can collect taxes and we can keep people off of our grain supplies coming up out of Egypt, you can pretty much otherwise do whatever you want to do. But you definitely have to keep things quiet. Okay, we don't want to be invading here every couple of years to put down some kind of Jewish nationalistic movement. But the Jews there in Palestine are kind of like the old Confederacy. They're going to rise again. They're never happy. And so the Romans have to keep coming back to Palestine, and they have to keep kicking butt and putting down these rebellions, because the Jews in their holy book says, hey, we had David, we had Solomon, we were a kingdom, we want to be a kingdom again. This is our destiny. And this goes on it was going on over 100 years before Jesus was born, and it goes on another 100 years almost after Jesus dies, before it finally just, fades away, and the Jews decide, okay, no more messiahs. Okay, we're done with messiahs. But you have to somehow get back into the history of it and read critically, but still read the history of what was going on there, and thinking, okay, what are the likelihood? What is the probability of X happening in this situation? What would people probably have thought? What would people probably have expected and said? What would probably have been feasible for these people? And in terms of knowing what people believed and what they were really thinking about, you could find somebody like Lucian of Samosata in translation, because you don't have to plow through it in Greek, which you could if you wanted. But go back and read some of his stuff, like the career of Peregrinus, the death of Peregrinus, it's called, and read The Lover of Lies and get a sense for what people believed and what was going on religiously in the Roman Empire, and what people thought. And when you read these stories, think, okay, he's telling these stories because people get the point, they get the connection, they catch these references. This is the common culture. And then look at the New Testament through that lens, but not go out in left field and think, because hippies are doing mushrooms today, that must have been what the disciples were doing. That's so 1960s, and it grows out of that culture. If I remember correctly, it's people were suddenly dropping acid and eating shrooms, and all of a sudden some guy says, this must have been what the apostles were thinking.
What the question that comes to mind is, out of all the mystery cults or religions or spiritual perspectives available in the Roman Empire, why would they take upon this religion that in the eyes of a lot of people was seen as subversive, seen kind of problematic? It came from a group of people that, even though there was some of them that they worked with the Romans, they had started a rebellion. Why take a Jewish savior as the banner for the Roman Empire that was at the point of collapse, and why would the Byzantine and other groups keep that going? In the Christian perspective, they would say is because God made a way for that to happen. But why? You mentioned last time we talked how there was a subversion aspect, that it was spread through the servants and the slaves and people slowly, but for it to take such a strong hold and become the fighting call of the Romans, where do you see that taking hold and becoming that powerful of an idea?
I think Christianity stops being Jewish at about probably year 50. I think that with, the reason that Paul is the putative author of almost half the books in the New Testament is because the Jesus in Paul is moving away from Judaism, and the Jesus in the Gospel of John is actually telling the Jews, you're not the son of Abraham, you're the son of Satan. I think that's what allows Christianity to penetrate into the greater Greco-Roman world, is that the mother church, if you want to call it that, in Jerusalem gets destroyed by the year 70 by the Romans. James, the brother of Jesus, gets stoned to death. Basically, he gets murdered at the instigation of the temple authorities, probably within, early in somewhere around Paul's career, because Paul meets James in Jerusalem, but James is subsequently killed. So, because of the shifting of demographics, Christianity moves from being a Jewish sect, which is increasingly despised by Jews, and it becomes basically a Greco-Roman religion. It becomes essentially a mystery cult. Nobody in the church after probably the year 100 is speaking Aramaic anymore, or nearly nobody. The remnant of Jews who believe in Jesus are now a heresy called the Ebionites. And the Christian church has moved way away from Jesus. Now we're using terms like God to describe Jesus, like in John 1:1. And regardless of how you interpret that, how literally you interpret that, that's not Jewish. That has moved away from Judaism. So there's that on one part. And then there's the fact that within the Greco-Roman culture, which we talked about before, an estimated 90% of people are basically illiterate. So Christianity is spreading as basically a set of narratives. And almost anybody in the Greco-Roman world can relate to some of it. It's got salvation, it's got a little of mystery cult, it's got a little of this, it's got a little of that. And besides, when you think about Christianity in the first century, the first couple of centuries, you're really not talking about a religion. You're talking about a whole spectrum of belief. You're talking about some people who now reject the Old Testament. You're talking about some Christians who believe only an edited version of the Gospel of Luke and some of the letters of Paul are the only things that count as Scripture. So you're seeing a very broad spectrum, and the Christian church doesn't actually begin to get its act together and begin to sort it out theologically until the late 4th century. They finally, about 325, they finally decide on the Trinity, as I recall. The Council of Nicaea, I believe, was about 325, and they finally decide that Jesus is a person of the Trinity. But even then, that's not really a settled question, because there are another heresy called Arianism that is very, very strong for decades after that. So by the time you get to the point where upper class Roman officials and emperors are converting to Christianity, whatever that means, Christianity is becoming a political force. It's becoming a cohesive political force that Rome is clinging to because of the number of adherents. So I think it's a lot more complex than what apologists want to make it. There are a number of things going on, but it's clear that by the 2nd century still, the average Roman intellectual thought Christians were rabid dogs running down the street. They were completely crazy. They were totally dismissed. But that was the Roman elite, and the Roman elite was a tiny percentage of the population. The people who were the literate, educated, powerful, rich people were probably like our 10% of today, probably even less.
So again, how did they take over?
They take over through, the question is, what do you mean by take over? Because by the time of the Emperor Julian, who makes that last stab at getting paganism reestablished, I think that the state cults of paganism, with their sacrifices of bulls and sheep and pigs and what have you, have they were kind of, fizzling out to some extent. The Roman Empire is now divided. There's an Eastern and Western Empire. So there's a question, realistically, is whether there still is a Rome as typically conceived, because it's no longer a unity. And you have to look at the history of Constantine and that dynasty. This is a dynasty that was basically murdering people right and left within its own family. So to call it Christian is kind of that's what they said, but they're certainly not Christ-like in the typical understanding of it. This is a ruthless political clan that continues to basically kill relatives so that they don't get challenged for positions of power. And in the meantime, you've got a mass of slaves and servants and soldiers and people at the bottom who have converted to Christianity, or at least different forms of Christianity. Constantine calls the Council of Nicaea to try to keep the bishops from fighting with each other over doctrine. So they're struggling at this point to hold it together and to keep the empire from fragmenting. And they're hoping, I think, at this point, that the Christian church is going to be the glue that keeps it together, which is why Constantine calls the bishops together and says, okay, guys, sort this out and stop excommunicating each other and anathematizing each other and banning each other and fighting among yourselves, because we've got to get some unity here. But even when Rome finally falls to the Goths that come in and start sacking the city are Christians. There happen to be Arian Christians. But I mean, so it's a very muddled picture. So to say that Christianity triumphs is yes and no. It depends on what do you mean by Christianity. Because the nascent beginning Catholic Church looks at most of these other divisions of Christianity as heretics, and they spend the next couple of centuries weeding them out. So it's kind of a political collapse at the same time that it is individuals within the Roman administration of the senatorial class that are basically moving into positions of power in the Christian church. As I recall, the Bishop Ambrose was not even baptized as a Christian when he was appointed bishop. He was baptized afterward. So you're seeing that the Christian church is kind of taking on the role of government at the same time that government is more or less unraveling and falling apart. I think Christianity, for one thing, had been taking over what we would call social services for quite a while. Julian complains about that the Christian women are hauling everything out of the house so that they can give it to the poor, while the husbands are going like, what the hell's going on here? Because the husbands haven't converted, but it's a women's religion, and they're seeing an opportunity to make disciples by liquidating the family's funds and basically buying converts in Julian's opinion. It's a complex question, but the idea that it's destined to happen because God wills, I think, is not historical.
How familiar are you with the priesthood from both Byzantine, Coptic, Roman Catholic, and all those groups, Syriac, and do you see any? Do you see that as a fabrication in a mixture of Greco-Roman cultic practices, or do you see some type of connection with Jesus and his followers and the way that he could have been considered like a priest in establishing sacraments and things like that?
No, I don't see that. I don't see Jesus as being a priest of any kind. I think my knowledge of Christianity is basically concentrated in the first century or so, specifically on Christian texts. I don't even pretend to know about all the subdivisions that come up in the 5th and 6th century and beyond. I think that, I would probably be the totally wrong person to get into that historical phase of late antiquity and beyond where the church goes.
But if you're familiar with Greco-Roman practices, do you see a connection between what the priests did for the Greek and Roman gods and what the Catholic Church and its many different forms, different bishops in the parts of the Mediterranean, do you see connections between some of the rituals?
No. In a word, the first big church history that we have on record is Eusebius' ecclesiastical history. And it's clear that Eusebius is just making things up at some point. Eusebius is now a spokesperson for an institutional church, what we would call the Catholic Church. And Eusebius is trying to create what some people have called an apostolic fiction. He's trying to create this idea that Jesus had these apostles and that he passed this teaching on to these apostles, and that the apostles in turn passed the teaching on to a succession of bishops, and he mentions the bishops of this city and that city and so on and so on. He's trying to establish a historical claim, a thread of authority that runs through this, when I think that the vast majority of mainstream New Testament scholars consider that to be completely fabricated from an organizational standpoint. It's clear that up even into the time of Constantine, that these churches were local, that they were locally organized, that they had fights between different regions. There was regionalism. There was competition. This was not an organized religion, for at least certainly not in the first century, and probably not well into the second century. There was no uniform belief. There was no canon of scripture that people didn't have, the 27 books of the current New Testament say, this is the Bible, all the rest of this stuff is just crap. There was no authority here. There's no central authority. Obviously, it tended to gravitate toward Rome, and the theory was that Peter and Paul end up in Rome because Rome was probably the largest community. I mean, it was the largest city. So naturally, it was going to develop the largest Christian community and the largest number of churches. But these churches in the first century were in houses. They weren't separate buildings. It wasn't like a quote-unquote church. These were people who were meeting in individuals' homes. There were probably, 20 or 30 people, maybe 40 at the most. These were not some kind of mega church situation like what we have today. So the continuity here is very much a construction of what I would call fake history. Eusebius is trying to to be an apologist for the church of his day and try to establish its credentials, its bona fides, by creating this illusion that there has always been this chain of command in place.
In the book, The Passover Plot, the writer says that it's interesting how you can find similarities between the birth narratives and the stories of different ancient gods. He mentions Hellas, that I believe is Mars, and then Hercules and stuff like that. Do you see those connections, or is that also like parallel mania and trying to connect it with things that are?
Yeah, that's a good term, parallelomania. I like that, actually. I might steal that from you. I might plagiarize that from you. I have always thought that the idea of Jesus, the Jesus myth, if you want to call it, being something based on the myth of, say, like vegetation gods, where the vegetation comes back annually, or where the Nile floods every year, and so on and so on. I've always found that to be kind of questionable, quite frankly. Anybody who knows anything at all about Christianity knows that the resurrection only happens once. It's not a cyclical thing. There's not really until about the 3rd or 4th century, when, let us call it, Mariolatry gets involved, that there's actually a mother figure anywhere in there. There's certainly no big mother figure in the New Testament. Jesus at the wedding in Cana, when Mary says, they've run out of wine, he's going to yeah, and so what? Basically, his relatives decide that he's crazy. In the Gospels, in the Gospel of Mark, they say, hey, he's out of his mind. It's not like Jesus was a big family guy and that he had great relationships with his parents. Joseph isn't mentioned after the birth of Jesus. You never hear about him again. So I've never really seen the parallels between the Greco-Roman gods that come back to life all the time and Jesus. Obviously, that was there, that was out there. It wasn't certainly at all strange that gods would change form or come back to life. But you have to remember that Jesus was a pretty orthodox Jewish guy, from as far as we can tell, from a small Jewish village. And I don't think that at the earliest level of Christian belief that there was much of a tendency to think of Jesus in terms of a pagan god. I think it would be pretty much the other way around. What would happen later on in centuries after that, obviously, was not under Jesus' control anymore. But I would certainly think that was not something that you could trace back to the most primitive points of Christianity.
The last comment, Israel Knoll, who wrote the book about the previous Messiah or something related to, he wrote 2 books, one about the Essenes messianic figure and one about the Gabriel tablet. He was saying that it wasn't a Greek god per se, but it was this idea of the emperor being the son of God, and that somehow got integrated into the narrative about Jesus, as they were trying to have like a competing worldview of the despot from the Roman Empire versus the savior from the Jewish Christian way. Do you see any possibility of that being a factor?
Yeah, I look at all of that kind of stuff as with a great deal of skepticism. There have been, I wouldn't even want to attempt to enumerate all the possibilities that have been tossed out there. Jesus is Osiris, and Jesus is this, and Jesus is that. I think that if you interrogate Mark particularly, I think that the picture of Jesus is actually pretty simple. Jesus was basically an apocalyptic figure who thought that the end of the world order was at hand. I don't think he thought it was the end of the earth, the end of the world as we think of it today. It wasn't the earth burning up or some kind of grandiose, silly thing like that. I think that what Jesus believed was that the time of deliverance was at hand, that God had saved the Jewish nation from Gentile powers before, particularly from Egypt, and that it was time for God to come back and restore a Jewish kingdom. I think that that was the nature of his apocalypse, that the apocalypse that he predicted, the end, the judgment, whatever, that he predicted and that John the Baptist predicted was the Romans are going to get thrown out of here. We can't do it, but God will. God is going to come back here. He's going to, kick these Gentiles all the way back to Italy. And we're going to have a kingdom again. We're going to be God's chosen people. We're going to follow his laws strictly. That's what we're going to do. And it's going to happen any minute now. And I think that when Jesus took that position and went to Jerusalem during Passover, which of course Passover is what? The commemoration of the Jewish deliverance from the Egyptians. In other words, from Gentiles. So if Jesus goes to the temple in Jerusalem and starts preaching about we're going to be delivered from these people, which includes the Sadducees, the Herodians, the Jews who were sympathetic to the Romans, who were working with the Romans, the temple authorities, in other words, say, you know what, scoop this guy up, get him off the street, crucify him. And I'm sure that there were hundreds of people like this. Josephus mentions them. He mentions Theudas. He mentions this character they called the Egyptian. Origen mentions a number of such people that were basically rabble-rousers. They were kingdom of God preachers who were, the end is here. And the Romans are going like, oh, no, it's not. And they nailed these people up, no doubt, by the hundreds. How would Jesus prove that he was, this prophet? How would he prove that the end was here? He would prove it the way all the others did. He would work miracles, particularly exorcisms. He would be casting devils out. He would be giving people a foretaste of what God's kingdom was going to be. But that kingdom was going to be a Jewish kingdom with a Jewish king. And that's how his disciples clearly understand it. In Mark 10, he talks about, you may lose your house now, but you'll have 100 houses. You'll have 100 fields. Well, he can't be talking about heaven. I mean, you're not going to get 100 fields of heaven in heaven. In the first chapter of Acts, it talks about we were hoping he would restore the kingdom to Israel. Well, that's what he was preaching. He was preaching the kingdom will be restored to Israel. Now, what happens later with the Apostle Paul and with others who say essentially nothing about Jesus' ministry. He says, Paul never mentions Jesus' miracles. He barely mentions Jesus' teaching. All he's concerned about is Jesus was raised from the dead, and we're going to heaven now. And that's when I think that the resurrection becomes the cornerstone of Christian belief. It was the cornerstone of Paul's belief. But if you read Paul is not exactly the most consistent thinker in the world. Paul is seeing visions right and left. He's seeing a vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus. For all we know, Paul was clinically insane. Functional, but clinically insane. But going back and digging all of this out at this point is in my view, impossible, because what we have of Paul are just like the general belief among New Testament scholars is that of all the letters that Paul supposedly wrote, only 7 at best are authentic. And those are not letters where Paul sits down and explains his whole theology in detail. Those are letters, occasional letters to congregations concerning particular matters at that moment. We don't have a book of Paul that tells us, that explains in detail and lays it all out systematically what Paul believed or thought he believed. It appears that Paul's belief actually changed from moment to moment and from time to time. He's not highly consistent about what he says. And that's kind of where I think that's where we are, that we're stuck with this record of Christianity, and most of what we could potentially ask, we can't get an answer for because it's gone. But, the Passover plot and some of these other books that you mentioned, I don't know, to me, any kind of thing, I suppose, is within the realm of possibility. But as I said before, I try to deal with what's probable, what's not just possible. And I would put the probability of stuff like that as being extremely low.
Any parting comments for our audience regarding the quest for truth or historical criticism, and what is the thing that you would like for people to take away from your books and your resources available online?
I think that the thing I would tell people is that the study of Christianity has been privileged because Christianity itself has been treated as different from every other religion. And so the kinds of techniques that you would use, the methods that you would use to study other religions have not been applied to Christianity until really quite recently, actually less than really for all practical purposes 100 years, and even then very selectively. If you're talking about Bible colleges, you're still talking about people who are probably what are called inerrantists, who believe that, if it says it in the Bible, it's got to be true on some level. I would say, look at the New Testament critically. Look at it open-mindedly. Don't be gullible. Don't fall for just any explanation. Don't just pick up, the demons and angels or something and read it and assume that the person has, knows what they're talking about. But don't be gullible about how Christian scholars who basically have a dog in the fight, what they say about the religion. Because there is an apologetic tendency, an apologetic meaning a justification, a tendency to say, well, yeah, but this religion is special. It may not be literally true. Maybe Jesus didn't literally rise from the dead, but it's still special. Maybe not so much. So that's why I post a lot of the stuff that I do on Scribd.com under Robert Connor. You can look it up. I've got a number of things on there. Like I say, I concentrate on text. I believe that you go back and you look at your actual sources because that's really all you have at the end of the day. And you read it critically, and you apply the canons of interpretation. You don't just go off on, jump off a cliff somewhere. Interpretively, you look at it critically. You look at what the evidence is. You evaluate the argument. You go from there. It's the best I can say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, and we really appreciate, again, you sharing your research and your thoughts with people from the Mystic and the Skeptic.
Absolutely. My pleasure. It's good talking to you.
Thank you. Take care.
Sure. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. We will be back next week with another episode of The Mystic and the Skeptic.
Show descriptions and content are available online on our Facebook page and on SoundCloud.com.
We would like to thank the Independent Media Club at the Farm for their continued support and Radio Free Nashville for their technical guidance and assistance.
The opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect those of anyone but the person speaking. They do not necessarily reflect the opinions of What's Radio or The Farm.